And we're back again. So we've talked about what critical thinking is, both from a teleological perspective, what it's for, and got into the super basics of the mechanics of what it is. And we're going to continue diving into those mechanics until we really understand how it works. But before we take that deep dive, because that one takes a long time, let's address the more succinct but higher level side quest of addressing why not everyone is a critical thinker all the time. Mostly because, well, there are actually a lot of reasons. One is because critical thinking's hard and time consuming. It's sometimes likened to thinking in reverse. Well, it involves a lot of checking and investigating all the theoretical possible reasons and outcomes, knowing that most of those are going to be complete dead ends, but still mapping out all the dead ends instead of just going down the one right path. And so thinking critically is going to be a lot slower and sort of less efficient than many heuristic alternatives where you just jump to a conclusion. And in many times, one is under time pressure. And if you don't have the luxury of time, then critical thinking, or too much of it, would be truly maladaptive. It's too slow. However, some people make the mistake of overgeneralization and go from the reality that sometimes we don't have time for critical thinking to getting lazy and never doing it, even though sometimes we do have the time to think about things in a logically exhaustive manner. Fortune favors the prepared. But if you compare the two side by side, jumping to conclusions via quick heuristics versus systematic critical thinking, jumping to conclusions, it's a straight, short line, problem to solution. Whereas critical thinking would be, you'd be all over the place and going backwards about 49% of the time, and only eventually getting to the conclusion. Like the SpongeBob method for bubble blowing is a nice visual metaphor for what critical thinking would look like to an outside observer. Not exactly sure which SpongeBob episode that is. Probably just search SpongeBob blowing bubble. And it's the most famous scene. It's a little hard to reproduce, especially with limited space, but it's memorable. Another impediment, another reason. So sometimes critical thinking's feasible, sometimes it's not. And we've said that people are usually overly quick to assume that it's not feasible. That's largely due to cultural and evolutionary lag. Like today, we have the internet, we have calculators, we can ask other people, we can do experiments, we can look up other people's experiments and read papers on those experiments and then debate those experiments online with other people who then do other experiments. We can get data. If there's a question, we can at least do a real lot of sciencey stuff to help us solve it. And even if I'm bad at science or bad at math or even bad at critical thinking, I can at least pop the question out there and hand it off to other people who are interested, and they'll use their stronger brains than mine to get us somewhere. So, in today's modern, scientific, very connected, quick communication world, critical thinking is equipped to produce some good results. That reality is very new, both on a historical scale and very, 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 very new on an evolutionary time scale. For most of recorded history, and almost completely all of biological history, the stuff I described was not the case. You couldn't wonder something and then look up on a database finding 50 papers written on that question, read those, debate other people's answers in your own head, then ask people on the internet questions about your questions about those studies. For most of the time that humans have been on Earth and any animals have existed, the stuff I just described was completely impossible. Or at least very, very impractical. For most of history, there just weren't the tools available for critical thinking to produce good results. Like, people in antiquity and probably even cavemen 100,000 years ago weren't all that dumb, as in that they didn't have the mental horsepower to do thinking. Just a lot of critical thinking would have been pretty useless because they couldn't go to the internet, get the information, ask other people, physically do an experiment themselves. They just didn't have these resources via which to make critical thinking actually produce results. It's only very recent in animal history and human history that critical thinking actually producing good results quickly and consistently has become the case. And culture, and even more so instincts, have not caught up with that change yet. So critical thinking tends to get underrated as a useful tool. Because its rise to usefulness has been meteoric and pretty recent in historical and evolutionary terms. But with thinking and taking a whole class on it, we can catch ourselves up.